There are days when truth burns brighter than the sun, and this is one of those days. When a people wearied by war and scorched by betrayal rise up with courage rather than collapse with fear. The world must watch and listen. There are moments in history when the oppressed are expected to remain silent, when the world presumes their spirit to be broken, and their backs too tired to carry the weight of resistance. But strength does not need the world's permission to rise. It stirs in silence, builds in shadows, and then steps into the light with the defiance of a storm. Yemen, battered by years of conflict, facing hunger, instability, and siege, has shown that the strength of a people cannot be measured in how much they suffer, but in how they respond. And in a powerful response, Yemeni military forces intercepted and seized thousands of missiles and weapons that were meant to further destroy them. They didn't wait for help, they didn't beg for rescue, they acted, and in that act, they defined strength, not in firepower, but in fearless purpose. To watch those who have every reason to fall, choose instead to rise, is to witness something holy. Yemen was not supposed to push back this way. It was not expected to seize weapons funneled by a powerful regional player like Iran. It was expected to endure quietly, desperately, tragically, but strength has a strange way of announcing itself. It does not come dressed in gold or polished with ceremony. It comes raw. It comes from mothers who raise sons into soldiers with stories instead of schooling. It comes from commanders who fight not for power but for their people's right to sleep without fear of the next explosion. It comes from the old man guarding his gate with nothing but his resolve, and the young woman treating the wounded in a darkened clinic, refusing to flee. The world rarely notices the moment when strength is born, but it notices when strength stands. When Yemen's military forces seized those shipments of missiles and weapons, they didn't just stop an attack, they stopped a narrative. The narrative that Yemen is a pawn, the narrative that its soil can be used for proxy wars, that its people are victims without voice, survivors without strategy. With this action, they didn't just intercept missiles, they intercepted years of doubt, fear, and manipulation. They told the world, "We are not your battlefield. We are not your silent sufferers. We are the strength that endures." Strength isn't always the ability to strike. Sometimes it's the wisdom to wait, the courage to hold ground, and the audacity to act when no one expects you to. In Yemen's case, it was all three. These weapons were meant to fuel more fire, to rip more families apart, to deepen a crisis that has already choked so many lives. But the people who stood in the line of that fire, they did not blink, they did not fold, they stood firm. That is not weakness. That is the roar of a nation too strong to kneel any longer. This moment is not simply a strategic win. It is the manifestation of a soul that refuses to quit. When everything around you crumbles, and you still rise, that is strength. When you're surrounded by enemies and betrayal, and yet you move forward, that is strength. Yemen has spoken not in speeches but in action, not with noise but with resolve. It is a reminder to the world that strength is not always at the center of attention. Sometimes it lives quietly in the hearts of those who refuse to let their land be stolen, their voice be drowned, or their future be written by others. Strength rises when oppression thinks it has won, and Yemen just proved it. Justice does not always ride in on chariots or arrive to fanfare. Sometimes it walks slowly, steadily, and in silence, while the world looks the other way. In Yemen, a place scarred by betrayal and burdened by the footprints of too many foreign powers, justice did not roar, it arrived. It came not from distant courts or global councils, but from the hands of those who had suffered longest. When Yemen's military seized thousands of missiles and weapons sent by Iran to fuel conflict to the Houthis, it wasn't just an operation. It was the quiet footstep of justice entering a room no one believed it would reach. For years, Yemen has endured more than just war. It has endured manipulation, the theft of its sovereignty, and the heavy weight of being treated as a pawn on a global chessboard. Weapons, influence, ideology, all were sent from abroad, wrapped in strategies that ignored the people living beneath the bombs. The truth is, justice had been delayed for too long. It had been buried beneath headlines and twisted in the narratives of those who saw Yemen not as a homeland, but as leverage. But justice does not stay buried. It does not forget the tears of mothers, or the silence of children who once laughed. It finds a way. And it found a way through courage. The act of seizing those weapons may seem, on the surface, a military maneuver, but it was far deeper than that. It was the reclaiming of space, not just physical ground but moral ground. Yemen, so often spoken for, finally spoke for itself. It said, "We know what you are doing. We see the manipulation, we feel the fire, and now we act." The message was not only for those who sent the weapons, but for the world that assumed Yemen could no longer resist, the world that had grown accustomed to seeing it only as a headline of misery. What was taken from Yemen was more than peace, it was the right to choose its path. But in that interception something profound occurred. Justice took form. It did not need a speech. It did not demand applause. It simply acted. With each weapon seized, a lie was exposed, a false promise was shattered, and a nation bruised by interference reclaimed part of its voice. There is something deeply human about justice. It does not always wear armor or raise banners. Sometimes it is simply a soldier who decides not to let another convoy pass. Sometimes it is a general who says no more. Sometimes it is a people who have endured so much pain that they no longer fear anything. Justice is not about revenge. It is about restoration. It is about making wrong things right, not by shouting but by standing. The world often expects justice to be wrapped in law, to be argued in courts, and signed into declarations. But some forms of justice are older than laws. They come from the heartbeat of a people who refuse to stay silenced. Yemen's justice was not imported. It rose from within. It was born in the knowledge that enough was enough, that the time for silence was over, that the time for submission had passed. This act, this bold seizure of tools meant to destroy, was a beginning. It reminds us that even in the darkest places justice walks. It does not run, but it never stops. It may be mocked, it may be ignored, but one day it arrives, not with noise but with power. And on that day even the mighty pause, because when justice finally speaks, its voice cannot be denied. Yemen's voice, long silenced, has found that voice, and in doing so it has reminded the world. Justice may be quiet, but it is never gone. Courage does not announce itself with drums. It does not ask for eyes or applause. True courage is silent. It does not tremble in the presence of danger, nor does it boast in moments of calm. It simply stands, steady, unwavering, and often unnoticed. In Yemen, courage has taken a shape that most of the world has failed to fully grasp. In the seizing of thousands of smuggled missiles and weapons sent by Iran to fuel proxy conflict, it wasn't noise that won the moment. It was the stillness of brave hearts who refused to be intimidated. It was the quiet, steadfast presence of those who chose duty over fear. There was no guarantee of success. There never is when courage takes the lead. The forces involved could have been ambushed. They could have been overwhelmed. The enemy was not only armed with weapons but with international networks, foreign funding, and the arrogance of those who think no one will stand in their way. But courage, real courage, doesn't calculate odds. It simply it moves forward not because the path is clear, but because the cause is just. The men and women of Yemen who intercepted those weapons weren't searching for headlines. They were defending their homeland, their children, their right to live without shadows overhead. The world tends to misinterpret silence. It assumes that those who don't scream have surrendered, that those who don't fight back loudly are weak. But Yemen has shown that silence does not mean submission. There is a type of strength that simmers below the surface, and when it finally moves, it changes everything. The military forces didn't make noise, they made history. They didn't threaten, they acted. That kind of courage echoes louder than gunfire. In the eyes of many, Yemen has been a land of devastation, a canvas of war, a tragedy constantly unfolding. But courage tells a different story. Courage says that this land, though wounded, still has warriors. that its people, though tired, are not broken, that despite being surrounded by conflict, chaos and manipulation, there are those who stand up and say, "Not here, not now, not again." Those soldiers who intercepted death midair and halted destruction before it could spread, proved something rare, that you do not have to be the loudest to be the bravest. It is easy to think of courage as a moment, a single act, a flash of heroism. But what Yemen teaches us is that courage is also endurance. It is day after day of choosing not to give in. It is the decision to keep patrolling, to keep resisting, to keep believing that this war, like all storms, will pass. And in the meantime, they will do everything in their power to shield what remains and restore what was lost. This is not reckless bravery. This is rooted, thoughtful, principled courage, the kind that outlives bullets and bombs. This courage does not crave recognition. It does not need medals. Its reward is simpler: to look in the mirror and know that even when fear came close, it did not win. The seizure of those weapons may seem like a single victory, but it represents countless unseen moments of bravery. Every checkpoint held, every night without rest, every time a soldier said goodbye to their family not knowing if they would return, that is the real face of courage. And so the world must learn to look beyond the noise, to see the quiet heroes who act without fanfare. Yemen is full of them. This moment, this interception, was not just a display of tactical success. It was a reminder that courage, though often quiet, is the loudest voice in the struggle for peace. It does not need to scream to be heard. It simply needs to stand, and it always does. When nations begin to crumble and institutions falter, it is the brave, not the powerful, who rebuild the path forward. Yemen has been standing at the edge of collapse for years. A country stretched thin by foreign meddling, economic devastation and internal strife. Yet even as the world looked on with weary eyes or turned away in fatigue, something remarkable stirred beneath the surface. It was not wealth, it was not diplomacy, it was not some miraculous intervention. It was the courage of those who refused to give up on their homeland. When Yemen's military intercepted thousands of smuggled weapons and missiles meant to fuel further conflict, it wasn't just an act of defense. It was a declaration that the nation, though bruised, still belonged to its people. Every time a nation faces collapse, there is a choice to be made. Do its people give in to despair, or do they become the architects of their own renewal? In Yemen, that choice was made not in grand halls or international meetings, but in dusty streets, at remote outposts, by soldiers and citizens who understood that survival is not enough, dignity must remain. The seizing of those weapons was not just a tactical success, it was the kind of moment that rewrites the course of a nation's future. It was Yemen stepping out of the role of passive victim and into the stance of active protector. The world too often writes off countries in conflict. The narrative becomes one of failure, of hopelessness, of endless war. But those who carry the burden of such stories are not simply victims of circumstance. They are also the ones who carry the fire of change. In Yemen, that fire burned through the lies and manipulation that had allowed foreign powers to funnel weapons into the hands of those who would tear the nation further apart. The interception was a strike not only against violence but against the belief that Yemenis could not protect their own destiny. Bravery in times like these does not wear crowns. It wears uniforms stitched with sweat and dust. It walks barefoot across landscapes littered with the remains of battles. It speaks in firm commands and silent prayer, in eyes that have seen too much yet still look forward. The Yemeni military, in reclaiming control over what was meant to destroy them, sent a clear message: we may be battered, but we are not broken. We may be bleeding, but we are not lost. That message echoed louder than any bomb. It reverberated across borders and into headlines, where even powerful nations such as the United States took notice and offered praise not out of pity but out of recognition. The path forward for Yemen will not be easy. The debris of war does not vanish overnight. The wounds of division do not heal quickly. But this moment matters because it shifts the balance. It proves that the spirit of Yemen is not owned by outsiders or buried in rubble. It lives, and it is guarded by those brave enough to step forward, even when every step feels like resistance. This is how nations rebuild, not through sweeping miracles, but through small acts of boldness that compound into momentum. One successful interception today becomes a stronger defense tomorrow. One brave soldier inspires 100 more. One moment of clarity can undo years of chaos. Yemen is not just surviving, it is reclaiming. With every move made by its own people, it draws closer to becoming not a place torn by history, but one defined by resilience. When nations falter, the brave are the ones who carry the torch through the darkness. They are the first to act, the last to give up, and the ones history remembers not for how they suffered, but for how they rose. Yemen is rising, quietly, steadily, bravely. The winds of change do not wait for permission. They do not ask for approval from the powerful, or knock gently on the doors of nations in turmoil. They arrive swift and undeniable, carried by the breath of those who dare to defy what has always been. In Yemen, where war has long been the language of the day and foreign influence has drawn the borders of chaos, a new wind has begun to blow. When the Yemeni military seized thousands of weapons and missiles sent by Iran to fuel the Houthi conflict, it was not just a security operation, it was a signal that the tide is turning. That change, real change, is beginning to stir, not from outside pressure but from within the will of the people themselves. For years Yemen was written off by many as a fractured land, a forgotten war zone, a country caught in the grip of forces beyond its control. Its skies have been filled with the thunder of bombs, its land carved into territories by foreign agendas, its people pushed into survival mode. But history has shown that when change finally comes, it doesn't announce itself politely. It comes through bold actions taken by those who've had enough. The interception of weapons that could have deepened destruction was such an action. It was Yemen speaking on its own terms, saying, "We decide what enters our land, we choose what future we will build." There is a special kind of power in reclaiming one's agency after years of being dismissed. This act was more than an interruption of smuggling routes. It was the reclaiming of authority over the land, the air, and the narrative. Yemen is no longer waiting for others to bring stability. It is creating its own, piece by piece, action by action. The winds of change are not waiting for a perfect political solution or international intervention. They are being powered by those on the ground, soldiers, communities, and leaders who understand that change is not a gift but a struggle. This shift matters not just for Yemen, but for the region. For too long, proxy conflicts have treated nations like battlegrounds and civilians like collateral. Yemen's refusal to accept more weapons of war is a declaration that the country refuses to be used any longer. That decision is revolutionary. It disrupts the strategies of those who thrive on chaos. It gives momentum to the forces of order, of independence, of peace, not as an abstract idea but as a living reality being built in real time. The courage behind this change is not rooted in speeches or symbolism. It is found in checkpoints, intelligence reports, late-night operations carried out by people who believe that a different future is still possible. It is found in the determination to act, to disrupt, to take the risk of resistance. These are not just soldiers, they are the front line of transformation. Their message is clear: change is not coming from abroad. It is rising from the soil of Yemen itself. Even powerful nations have noticed. Their praise is not the end, but a recognition that something authentic is shifting. Yemen is no longer simply reacting to the world's choices, it is making its own. The winds that now sweep across this land are not the storms of war, but the stirrings of renewal. And they will not be stopped by fear, by doubt, or by the weight of history. The winds of change blow hardest where resistance is fiercest. Yemen has stood long enough in the shadow. It now moves forward with intention. What was once seen as only a land of suffering is revealing itself as a source of strength, not because someone gave it permission but because its people claimed the right to rise. And now nothing can hold back the coming wind.